So good morning, everyone. My name's Brian Meacham. I'm uh, managing this initiative for ICC on reimagining the ICC performance code. And what we're doing is conducting some research to see kind of where we're at with ideas of the performance code and performance-based design in the US. It's been 20 years since the performance code was first drafted. A lot of things have developed since then. We have, some disciplines that we weren't even looking at 20 years ago, like energy, that are almost exclusively performance-based in some areas. Structural engineering for different hazards has advanced a lot. And it just seems like it's time to, have a look at, is performance-based codes and performance-based design time to be doing a bit more in the US? And if so, what would an ideal performance code look like if ICC were to start a new effort in that area? So I've been running roundtables with different groups, building officials, architects, fire protection engineers, structural engineers, energy, and other. And today, of course, is to get input from a fire service perspective on performance codes and design. And so after this introduction from me, I'm hoping a lot of the discussion and input will be from you. I'm here to learn and to capture your views for others to hear on what are some of the pros and cons, issues to direct, to focus on, things that we should try to address if a new code development effort goes forward. And so with that, what I'd like to do is go around the room and ask each one of you to introduce yourselves, what your affiliation is, and reference to your knowledge of the fire service and how you've worked in regards to performance and what you're hoping to see out of this effort going forward. And then we'll start to tackle some of the issues. So I'll go around the room and based on who I see on the screen, hopefully it won't move around too much and I'll keep track of everybody here. And then we'll jump into it. And probably the easiest way once we get going into the discussion part is if you can use the raise the hand feature. I can pick on you just to keep the discussion flowing. But to kick it off, up in the upper left-hand corner of my screen is Dwayne Garris. So we'll kick off with Dwayne.
All right. Thank you, Brian. So my name is Dwayne Garris. I'm the retired state fire marshal of Georgia. Had 33 years in the service. Background actually is in architecture. So I have a degree in architecture, never been a firefighter in that aspect, but was hired on with the state in 1988 and started out as a plans examiner. And in that aspect, of course, with the state, we did mainly prescriptive based codes, but in some large projects such as the Georgia Dome, the Congress Center, the new Falcons Mercedes-Benz stadiums, the Kia plant, some of these large facilities, we did do performance-based standard codes, criteria, and evaluation. So we do have a little bit of experience in that aspect. I was also the ICC president, which actually that's where I met Brian. Got to go over to the International Code Regulatory CRR. Is that what it is?
IRCC, yep.
IRCC, and found out that most of the European groups, I guess, do performance-based, and they're trying to go a little bit more prescriptive, and we're vice versa in the country. So that's my background. I'll let you keep moving.
Thank you. Jen.
Hi, I'm Jen Hoyt. I am the Chief Fire Protection Engineer in Massachusetts. I represent the State Fire Marshal on most technical boards and committees. I work with the building code, which we adopt the ICC model, and then the fire code, which we adopt NFPA 1 and the NFPA codes. So get a little bit of everything. And a lot of times anything new that comes into the state, cannabis, hydrogen vehicle fueling, a lot of those things require some type of performance-based analysis because it's not code regulated, but we're trying to be as uniform as possible so that typically guides where we're going in terms of writing amendments to the codes for Massachusetts to deal with those issues. And a lot of times our office is a technical resource for the fire department. So if there are performance-based designs done by other engineers, typically we give them a second opinion or a read on where we'd like to see more information before it goes through the process. I'm also a call volunteer firefighter in my hometown. So, and I've been in the industry for 13 years, 7 years at the state, and I was a code consultant for the time before that as well. So.
Great, thank you. Robert Davidson.
Davidson, Davis Code Concepts, 33 years in emergency services, the last 22 as a fire marshal in New Jersey. Led to heavy involvement in code development processes, including serving on committees up to including chair of the International Fire Code Committee. Served on a bunch of other ICC committees. Back then, this particular document actually would occasionally come before the Fire Code Committee because after they did the initial establishment, then unfortunately they didn't keep a live committee. So it was a matter of who's going to handle the handful of changes that would come in. And it was, unfortunately, the history is only a handful of changes. I've done some peer reviews for agencies dealing with performance-based applications. Probably the largest thing I see is a partial performance-based application. In other words, they're really building to the codes as structured, but they come across something they want to drop in a performance-based in and of itself. That's probably the greatest experience I have dealing with that.
Great, thank you. Jonathan Lund.
Hi, thanks, Brian. Jonathan Lund, I'm the fire marshal for Des Moines, Iowa, currently. Fire protection engineer, 15 years in Des Moines, 20 years in the fire service. We've had several, similar to Robert Davidson, several performance-based alternatives, but not full-blown design for our arenas and some high-rise buildings and other selected features of those projects. So yeah, I'm very interested in how performance-based design should occur. We typically see that most people aren't willing to invest the time and effort, even though there may be a benefit, into the performance-based design process. Also, some of my background, I was the chair of the Midwest Regional Work Group for the Fire Code for a number of years before they dissolved that process, and lead a local code consortium here where we have 18 municipalities that try to adopt a uniform code within the Des Moines metro area. So happy to be part of the group.
Thank you very much. Timothy Deal.
Hi, Tim Deal. I'm a retired fire battalion chief from Howard County Fire and Rescue. I did 25 years of service with fire and rescue there in Maryland. I retired and then went to go be the fire marshal in the city of Rockville, which is Montgomery County, where I reviewed the building and fire plans for that office for several years. Left to go to private industry. So I was working with Global Fire Protection Group for a while. It's where I got a lot of performance-based and a lot of inspection from there. I'm also a fire investigator certified, so I handled those applications also. I'm currently a member of the Fire Service Membership Council, ICC. So I've sat through the multiple hearings, as well as I sit on a couple NFPA technical committees also. So I just have a little bit of experience reviewing performance-based design. Really, primarily when I was a fire marshal for Rockville, we had a lot of special and high-rise buildings going on in the urban setting. So that's really where my background goes, as well as global. I did review engineering judgments, EJs. So help set those and write those up. That's it.
Great, thank you. Steve Winkle.
Hi, I'm Steve Winkle. I'm with the Preview Group, and I'm the West Coast office in Berkeley, California. I'm an architect. I'm the token architect, I think, on call today. Although Dwayne is on it as well, I noticed. I'm also a civil engineer and a certified access specialist in California. I've been doing code development for about 40 years. I was on the California Building Standards Commission for 18 years before I retired from that. I'm on the interpretive committee at ICC. I was also on Building Code Action Committee. I'm on the general committee as well. So I've been active through AIA as testifying on behalf of the AIA at code hearings since, well, for the whole length of the ICC, having been a good friend of Bob Davidson, who helped get us all into this stuff. My experience, I think, parallels a lot of the folks here. Is I've done a lot of alternate means requests, which are kind of mini performance code basis for specific issues on projects, but have very little experience at doing general performance code. AIA in the last code cycle, working with some of the structural engineers, has been trying to revitalize interest in the performance code. So we're very interested in participating and following this process as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Greg Rogers.
Thanks, sir. About 26, 27 years in the fire service. Most of that in the prevention realm, whether doing plan review, inspections. Currently the fire marshal for the Spokane Valley Fire Department, deputy chief, and also serve as vice chair of the International Association Fire Chiefs Fire and Life Safety Section, which I think that's one of the reasons why I'm here representing that group, as well as a whole picture. My experience is very similar to everybody else's in regards to performance-based standards, or the use of performance-based is more of the alternative materials and methods that's been used throughout the code in regards to different projects. We used it on an institutional facility and a couple of different larger projects. Most people are probably know the Amazon projects that are going around. They do a performance-based standard review based upon the size of their project. But one of my interests is with this group, and the conversation and discussion is to see how it's intermixed or folded into, or how we can better integrate this into what we do.
Great, thank you. Dan Nichols.
Good morning, Dan Nichols, represent the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York and Lower Connecticut and the tri-state area. I'm a fire protection engineer. I currently hold two roles. I'm the Assistant Vice President of Code Compliance, Fire Safety, and Handicap Accessibility for the MTA. I also act in a role with a weird title that's kind of like the Chief Fire Marshal for Metro North Commuter Railroad Company. We do New York City Subway, Bridge and Tunnels, Metro North Railroad, Long Island Railroad, bus, oversee a $50 billion capital program for code compliance and fire safety. My background, like I said, is a fire protection engineer. I'm also a fire investigator and member of the fire service and past chief officer. My committee experience is I'm currently overseeing I have the illustrious title of being the chairman of the ICC Code Correlation Committee, which that is not first prize for anybody who's paying attention. I also serve on previous service on ICC committees. Glad to see some fellow alumni of the Regional Fire Service Action Committees on the call here. That's how I met most of you, actually, that I see. I also serve at NFPA on Fixed Guideway Transit, which is NFPA 130, and also on a little committee called Cultural Resources and Historic Preservation, 909-914. My purpose of being involved in all this performance-based design is that we see performance-based design, and I'll be blunt, when it's inconvenient to the design professional to follow the code, or if the project is outside the bounds of the code requirements and they want to fix a little piece of it because of an unknown section of the prescriptive codes. I agree with everybody else. It's piecemeal. It's not a holistic design, which I'm hoping that we can get to. But my biggest piece of the puzzle, after looking at 40 years of performance-based designs known as the variance process in the state of New York, is that how do you do fire inspections? How do you maintain and operate performance-based projects that had never been in a code for fire marshals, fire inspectors, housing inspectors, so on and so forth? And what are the tools available to maintain that alternate level of health, safety, and welfare in the building? So I'm glad to see everybody here. Look forward to the conversation. Most of you will not be shy with your collection of obsolete NFPA gadgets in the background of all of your videos. So thank you.
Thanks, Dan. John Nisja.
Well, thank you and good morning, everybody. John Nisha with the Minnesota State Fire Marshal's Division. Just started my 44th year in the fire service, and I've been doing inspections, prevention, investigation since 1983. So background with performance-based designs here, reviewed several of them. About 10 or 12 years ago, we seemed to have a run on building stadiums and arenas in our state. And so virtually every one of them wanted to do some kind of performance-based design. And we were all often called in to assist the locals who felt like they were overwhelmed or didn't know what to do, had never seen something like this before, things like that. So even some relatively small communities in our state experienced, now we've got a 5,000 or 10,000 seat arena coming in for hockey or basketball or civic arena or something. So they call us in for help. Most of the performance-based designs that I've seen, similar to what Dan talked about, or kind of one-up issues, there was something in there that they didn't want to do for whatever reason or another. So it's not what I would consider a true performance-based design, although I have seen a couple of those where it was true performance-based design right from the footings on up, everything in terms of fire protection is performance-based anyway. So my big issue is that the majority of the performance-based designs that I've seen are trying to get out of sprinkler protection. And I have a philosophical problem with that. How do you take something that's required and say it's not required? How can you have an alternate to a sprinkler system? And we've seen everything tried from, we'll throw a few smoke detectors up to I'll give you a smoke control system and so on. I just don't see that those are alternates. We even had one that said, well, we'll put a standpipe hose connection in. That's not an alternate to sprinklers. Besides, it's already required. So you're not giving me anything. So we have seen some performance-based designs in some of our iconic buildings that have been built. And I have the same concern that Dan mentioned. I have rarely seen a performance-based design that they didn't come back a year or two later and say, oh, yeah, that's what the design professional wanted. That's not working for us. We want to get rid of that. In one case, it was performance-based design specified that there would be a full engine crew on the site whenever it was used. And they came back later and said, we can't afford that. It just doesn't work for the life of the building in a lot of situations. So I'll get off my soapbox. Thank you.
Thank you. And Carl.
Hey, good morning, Brian. Hello to everybody. Carl Fippenger, Vice President, Fire and Disaster Mitigation, ICC staff, and the Government Relations Department. Really great crew here. I'm just kind of here to help cheerlead and hear and understand the conversation. I can tell you that some of this conversation has been coming up pretty frequently, particularly within the architectural community of late, probably the last year and a half. You hear a lot more kind of western half of the United States than I'm hearing it on the East Coast, but it is a pervasive conversation that's certainly gaining in momentum and growing some legs, so to speak. So 30 years in the fire service here, from firefighter to assistant chief, and kind of all the way around, and now kind of helping to champion the fire codes and the disaster resistant provisions of the I code. So glad to help out and provide staff support beyond what Brian's doing. And I'm sure he'll do a great job with this process, but wanted to make sure I was here available for any questions and want to hear the whole conversation. And most importantly, thank you all for participating in our process, no matter what your views on the subject. Dan, it wasn't lost on me in terms of your chairmanship of the Code Correlation Committee. A lot of this stuff that all of you participate in is super hard work, even whether it's our process or the NFPA process or others. So thanks for your love of the fire service and helping us all out to get where we need to be. And I'll give it back to Brian. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And again, I want to echo my thanks to everyone for being here and providing your input, because it's a really big topic and it's a really big challenge. And I think to kick things off, maybe a couple of observations and a question. It seems like there's experience across the board with performance-based approaches and a lot of challenges with, let's call it, the level of analysis that's undertaken and the gaps that exist in the work that's done and the expectations into the future. I think there hasn't been much said about the performance code and whether it had served any role in any of the designs that you've seen, and whether you think it's got any merit, or if there are so many gaps in it that it's not usable as is and what's needed forward. So what I'd like to do is maybe open it up a little bit just on to get some senses of whether there's experience with the performance code, even administratively, what you see as shortcomings and what would really help to guide designs forward. And then we'll come back a little bit later to talk about some of the gaps in design and what can be done working both within the code side, but then maybe in the engineering side as well. So is there anybody want to maybe jump in with any of those small questions? Go ahead, Dwayne.
Sorry, I was looking for the raised hand. I couldn't find it. So I think, and it may not be the actual performance code itself. I know that in the realm of work that I dealt with, there were certain items as has been indicated by several that wasn't, I guess, prudent for the designer to want to meet the prescriptive side. So they came up with a performance type standard to deal with. And I'll give you a couple examples. One is, of course, when we reuse a office building, and sometimes that office building was designed with a occupant load of 100 square foot per person, and then all of a sudden we have training facilities and stuff located in, we changed the business model of that organization who was occupying the building, and they've now turned it into a training complex or telemarketing area and stuff like that, and your occupant load shot up tremendously, which created problems for existing stair capacity and stuff like that. So as a performance type criteria or method of compliance, you had FPEs come in and calculate a exiting diagram or model to deal with, I guess, the herding issues of queuing and things like that, and getting the people out to show that it performed just as well as the prescriptive base model. So that's one thing. Another would be where we've had, you know, a public assembly building, and it just happened to be that partially part of the steel was below the 50-foot criteria. And so they didn't want to do the steel spray on fire protection. So they came in and sort of showed that the steel performed well, even with a, 5 kW fire underneath with double the fire load that was potentially going to be there. Heat the steel to show that the steel performed just as well as if it was fire protected, didn't lose any integrity in that aspect, because it was the magic number of 50 feet or 20 feet, whichever one it is, above the floor. And that's another area we dealt with. And then probably one more is it's really prescriptive, but it's performance based, which is your fire modeling and stuff with atriums and things like that. Just, I mean, you're guessing at scenarios that are going to exist, trying to say if this, then this can occur and stuff like that. So those are the three areas that I've sort of had experience with. I think that the key problem that I have as a local or as an AHJ is with the things that you're having to actually provide, I guess, the fire service responsibility for. I heard someone say that they had the potential of having the fire department there in the prescriptive type of performance side of the criteria. Well, that's a lifelong commitment. And today's chief is yes, tomorrow's chief is no, today's city councilor or whatever is yes, and everything else. So I think that's something that has to be very cautious with, is when you're dealing with dictation of personnel criteria. Again, today's administration may be acceptable, and the other one say I never agreed to that. So that one I would be very cautious of. My other concern, and I think I've mentioned this before, and I'm not sure exactly how it kicks in, but I want to go ahead and throw it out there, is where we're starting to look at some standards or some groups trying to look at fire protection systems and give a performance criteria or standard to eliminate inspection, maintenance, and testing for a period of time, and that's something that really concerns me. So that's my 2 cents worth. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve. And then Robert.
Yeah, I'm on the West Coast, and I think Brian touched on it in terms of a couple of things that have been in my experiences. We have a very robust energy code in California, and even single family residences are performance based. Basically, if you do prescriptive energy code, you end up with windows where you don't want them and they're too small. And so you spend $500 and give somebody with a computer program to run the model for getting your energy calculations done. So even on the single family, it's performance based, and it's also trade-off between assemblies, which doesn't have the implications of life safety that you find with the kinds of things that the fire service is dealing with. The other thing that I get involved with is I was on the FEMA P58, which is the criteria for structural design. I worked with that committee, and I would commend everybody to look at that P58 document as kind of a guideline for how you think about performance-based design. And a lot of people have made the comment, and it's really interesting, is there's kind of a dichotomy in the fire service. The alternate means or the other performance-based seems to be about avoiding something that's a problem in the code. Whereas my experience with structural design is you're really dealing with innovations in structural design, whether they're lateral force elements or cross-laminated timber or it's core, how the core works with relationship to the building and lateral bracing and things, especially in earthquake country. There's been no building designed in San Francisco or Seattle or Los Angeles, tall high rises without performance-based design in structural engineering. And the other thing is in structural engineering, you end up with an inspectable set of criteria because you have the performance-based design, peer review of the performance, detailing of the building structure that's going to guarantee or assure, guarantee, never use that word, going to ensure performance. And then you can inspect to that because you can see what you're doing in the field so that you're not deviating. The field inspector isn't trying to figure out what the performance-based criteria is. He's looking where the rebar goes so that it's possible to do that. So that I think that in structural engineering, in like I say, in my part of the country is really any large structures are all done that way. But again, reinforcing the other parts of it is my experience with specific conditions. And I've done several projects like the one Dwayne talked about, both in new construction and existing buildings and historic buildings of where they wanted to put this huge assembly occupancy for instructional purposes on like the 8th floor of a building, and you end up trying to figure out how to deal with the exiting system. And in that case, you're mitigating the problems, but you're dealing with very specific one-off kinds of things. So I'd say, energy and structure are light years ahead of us in terms of even medium-sized structures or small ones, even with energy and as models. And the P58 is, I think, looking at as a document, how you think about it is a good thing to look at.
Great, thank you. I had Bob next.
So, every cycle we have somebody try to drop some performance-based language somewhere in one of the codes. And a group of us tend to testify against it and say, there's already a performance code. Why are you not using the performance code? Why are we trying to blend it into the IBC, IFC? I look at these projects, the way they're handled, where they're building to the prescriptive codes, but they drop in a segment that's performance. My concern is they skip the way we're supposed to look at things performance-based, right? We're skipping chapter 3, design performance levels, that's in the performance code. We're skipping chapter 4, reliability. We're skipping that initial discussion where both the jurisdiction and a designer agree on what the goals are that this design is going to meet. So then in the end, we know what we're judging it against, right? It's not just this enigma that sticks out in the middle of a project, right? And that's a real concern, right? Because you may not be getting it right, right? If you skip that step. And that's how I look at it, right? That there needs to be more focus on, no, if you want to use the performance-based code, then do the application that way. You can use compliance, IBC, IFC, et cetera, to show compliance with various goals, right? Right? That's the way it's structured. And then we've identified how we're going to handle the parts that you're not using those for. That's the biggest issue that I see out there, that these projects in many cases are really broken because that step got missed. And you don't find out about that until way down the road, God forbid something happens, right? Part of this is part of this is education level. It really is education level. And one thing is, did the jurisdictions adopt the performance code, right? Do they have it right there, sitting there in their basket to say, hey, look, we have a performance code, use that code, right? So a big chunk of it's education level for the designers, as well as, and the design professionals, as well as for the code officials, right? I think that's the big part to get over. If we get over that, well, that would have generated the interest. Why aren't we updating this code the way we need to update this code? Why isn't it getting code change proposals every cycle based on that learning experience about what works and what doesn't work? And that's why we're in this little bit of a never land, because whether we use the word allow, permit, whatever, these projects should just drop a piece in there instead of starting from the beginning and following it through. We're breaking that linkage, and then we're not improving this code to where it should be.
Great, thank you. I had Dan next.
Sure. So I agree with Bob's position, but I'll maybe you asked a question that I don't think has been answered yet directly, so I'll answer it for you. Do people use the ICC performance code? No, they don't. They don't use it at all because I think there's a huge education piece to actually how to use the book, why it's there. And I'm glad Steve brought up the structural and the energy stuff because those have been performance based in many arenas for years. And the difference is that, it's very simple to figure out what the snow load is or the heating degree days or the thermal mass or the wind speed for a certain location. As we speak about climate change in today's society, we talk about 2 inches of water rise or 5% differential in rain production. And, we're putting those disciplines, on edge that they have to change all their stuff. Meanwhile, we could spend the remainder of this phone call talking about what the heat release rate is of today's 4-door sedan. And all of us, I'll tell you 2 things. All of us on this phone call would disagree with everybody else on what it is. And we'd all agree that the number that was used to create the open parking garage requirements is wrong. Okay, so, and I think I see everybody's head nodding. We'd all have a very spirited conversation. But the fact is that unlike structural and unlike energy, the input into what makes performance code for fire life safety issues is more of the unknown than what to do with it. Our egress is supposedly designed on a theater exiting in the 1920s where everybody got out in 3 minutes. Okay, that's the only number I can find where we get 3 minutes from. It lives to today. We throw 30 seconds on it because it has a sprinkler system or a fancy fire alarm. But by far and large, the issue with performance code for the fire group is the inputs. And I really think that chapter 3, chapter 4 that Bob spoke about is the key to solving that issue. A lot of work has to happen in that realm before we can even talk about how to apply it to a fire life safety discipline. So to the answer, no, nobody uses it because I don't think they know how to use it, or they're scared to use it in the front, or fancy FPEs like myself can go and talk you out of doing certain things. So thanks, Bob, for bringing that up. That is absolutely correct.
Thanks, Dan. John, missed you.
Yeah, Brian, thanks. I want to change my name here so that alphabetically I'm ahead of Dan because he keeps stealing my thunder. So thanks, Dan. I was involved in I was fortunate enough to be involved in some performance-based designs going back to the early 1990s when I think it was still in its infancy stages. And I remember sitting down one day with Bud Nelson, who was kind of one of the grandfathers of at least computer modeling, if not performance-based design. And he made an interesting comment, and I've used this a lot in training, especially when I'm training code officials on performance-based designs or alternates or computer modeling or whatever. And his sentence was, if the solution that they propose defies the law of physics or common sense, the solution is wrong. And it doesn't matter how many pages of paper the computer spits out to prove what they say, it's just wrong. For instance, we had a 14,000 square foot assembly building that they tried to tell us that the smoke fill time was significantly longer than the 3 minutes and 42 seconds it would take to get those 15,000 people out of that area. And I said, we can't evacuate a 2,000 person high school that does 10 of them a year in 3 minutes and 42 seconds. How are you going to do, 5 times that many people in that time? It's just wrong. As Dan indicated, we keep getting that 5,000 BTU or 5K kilowatt or fire thrown against us. That was something in England. It was a clothes rack. And as I understand, it was primarily cotton-based clothing. That has nothing to do with today's stuff. I was in one, they were going to do fiberglass boats and campers and cars in there. And I said, well, then give me like a 15K or a 20K fire, because that's realistically what you're going to get, or it's going to be a stage that goes 50 feet high and you're gonna do pyro in there, with it all being plastic. I said, give me a 15K. And the engineer came back and said, well, you know, that's gonna fail my building. So, well, yeah. So don't, you know, and it was all, you know, we don't want a sprinkler, we don't want a sprinkler, we don't want a sprinkler. So we just had one, and Bob Davidson's somewhat familiar with this. We just had one here where they wanted to do a performance-based design to allow trash storage in apartment corridors. They actually came in with that. And, oh, we're going to put some pixie dust in our plastic containers. So now that we've got this study here that shows that it won't burn. Well, yeah, okay, whatever. Like I said, if the answer defies the law of common sense or physics, it's wrong. What I'd like to see is, because some of this hasn't been changed, and I don't know, Brian, if you got any suggestions or anybody else, is, you know, in the early years, we didn't have any database of heat release rates and fires. You know, we've got a pretty good database now. And in those early days, it was all proprietary, so nobody wanted to share. Well, mine was 10,000, or, you know, mine was 15,000 or whatever. And now there's got to be a much bigger database. That would be very helpful for the engineering community to say, okay, a car on fire is this, a camper, a 15-foot boat is that, you know, whatever you can come up with, you know, a plastic stage is this, rather than having us just guess at them. And like I said, everyone defaults to that 5,000, which to me is not a valid study at all. So I'll shut up again.
Thank you. I'll provide a few thoughts in a minute, but I want to come to Jonathan, who has had his hand up, and then we'll talk about a few of these things. So Jonathan.
I'll be brief. I think people have mentioned pieces of this. I think the biggest hurdle to really seeing implementation or use of a performance-based code is improving the level of technical proficiency on both the AHJ side and then the process side for the designers. At least in my experience in Iowa, a lot of the designers are unwilling or unfamiliar with how to do a full scale performance-based design, or the municipality that they're dealing with doesn't have anybody on the AHJ side to review such a design. And so you're at a stalemate to begin with, and then people abandon it. And then, as many have mentioned, they just plug it in for a specific alternative. Oh, I don't want to put sprinklers, so I'm going to try to do this. And that's where then the AHJs, I think, again, primarily speaking for Iowa, get jaded to even the concept of a performance-based design, because their impression is it's always the designer trying to get out of something. I was at the SFPE performance-based design conference in New Zealand right before COVID broke out. And one of the professors from one of the universities in Australia said, you guys never do performance-based design in America because you have too many lawyers, which I thought was a clever perspective. But I really think that that's probably not the hindering factor. The hindering factor is not having the subject matter experts, both on the municipality or AHJ side, and then creating a familiarity with the process on the design side, so that you have the stakeholder meeting, you have the, agreed upon objectives before the design happens. Even in Des Moines, it seems like we'll get consultants come in, throw the models on the desk and say, okay, well, you approve this. I'm like, wait a second, we haven't had a stakeholders meeting. We haven't even decided on the design fire, but they've already predetermined what their design fire is going to be and what their objectives are without even consulting with us. I think that's the biggest hurdle, in my opinion. The details of the performance-based design code don't even come into play because we're not there yet. And I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. I mean, this is, really good discussion, really good input, and as a fire protection engineer, not surprising at all. And, and I mean that from the, we don't know what we're doing perspective, not that, fire protection engineers should be looking at what the fire service and building officials are doing as being problematic. It's because we aren't actually doing what we should do. And I think there's a lot of reasons in there. I liked what Bob had to say about, if you have the performance code on your desk, you're not having the discussions. Jonathan picked up on that, as others did too. And I think there's a real challenge that if you kind of compare to structural engineering or energy engineering or other areas, we haven't, as Dan pointed out, tackled the input side. We don't have a list of acceptable or benchmark loads. Structural engineers are not just designing, randomly to a load. They have pretty well defined statistically based loads that you're trying to design a resistance of the building to under certain conditions. We have a framework that says that, but fire protection engineers have been very reluctant to, say what should be a realistic load for a building. You shouldn't be optimizing to a particular chair because you know that the building is going to change over time. And for me, one of the big problems is we haven't advanced in 20 years the fact that, fire is a probabilistic issue. You're never going to have the fire you designed to, and it's probably going to be worse because the conditions will be different. So why are you optimizing at the low end rather than looking realistically? And so if I look to some other countries, for example, New Zealand has a what they call a verification method, the CVM2, which is a more rigorous kind of approach to the performance, where you start with some initial codified variables. For example, for most buildings, you're using a 20 megawatt fire as your starting point to then show, how it performs and how any systems are going to perform to it, rather than saying you're going to have a 1 kilowatt chair or a 5 megawatt sofa. You start with a realistic load and actually show through evaluation if it's not going to work, why is that? And they have codified pre-movement times, up to 10 minutes for hospitals and different factors, even, modeling parameters. And they've done that because of the inability of the, fire protection engineering community to actually, codify the process. So I think fire is unique from the other areas, like a lot of people have noted, because we have not quantified anything. And we don't actually have a good sense of performance. And a little bit the problem is, I think that we're working in this alternative methods and materials and not actually sorting out the objective. And Dan touched upon this a bit. For me, a fire safety objective is to, protect people in the building in the case of a fire and give them a safe, period of time to get out of the building without being impacted by the fire, and provide, a reasonably safe environment for the fire service while they're undertaking their operations. Well, that's all time. There's nothing about time in the prescriptive code. And if you're trying to assume it's based on this, 3-minute evacuation from 100 years ago, or somebody's analysis with no, grounding in agreed parameters, it's always going to be a little bit, well, it's never going to work, and it's always going to be too off the cuff. So from a code side, I think there's a good basis with the chapters 3 and 4 to put some rigor to the discussions. What fire is missing from the engineering side is the loads and the resistance factors. And, a lot of people have told me that you can't figure out what the fire load is. Well, believe me, I don't think earthquake loads are deterministic. If you can't do a kind of a probabilistic analysis of what your expected conditions can be based on what people can put in the building, what your ventilation rates could be, and everything else, and you're not doing a proper analysis. And this whole kind of concept that I'm hearing that people aren't following the process from step 1 is part of that issue. So kind of going back to the, if we were to look at what we can do with the performance code, it seems like really sorting out what the fire and life safety objectives really are in a way that can be measured, defining what the loads it would be to reasonably test the building, not what an individual engineer thinks a particular fire load would be, but what kind of the societal expectation is for the load that would test the building. What the acceptance criteria are, so that you're not, going from a 6-foot layer height in Massachusetts to a I don't know, a 20-foot layer height in a particular environment somewhere else. And then, what is the actual quantitative process you should have to follow robustly, not just kind of willy-nilly. So if we were able to say, can we build those measures into the performance code, and we'll not yet worry about what the engineers have to do to make it work. But if we were to build those types of things into the code, would that be a good first step into putting more rigor around how this should be done and actually demonstrating performance, taking into account, the variability and uncertainty that we know is going to exist. So that's a lot of words, but maybe we can kick that around for a little bit. Jen.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I end up doing is kind of like a mediator between the engineers and the AHJs. And a lot of times, if something is quantifiable and it is there or it's not, or it meets the criteria or it's not, that's a lot easier to analyze the overall performance-based design if there's some good concrete basis to it. So I think that's really important in terms of actually being able to use the code and then analyze the code. And I agree with, I forget who said that there's just not the expertise on the fire side. I mean, Massachusetts has tried to hire engineers for different jurisdictions, and we have 3 engineers for the state for 352 communities that have individual AHJs. It's overwhelming with the amount of information that you have out there. So if there's some criteria that can kind of be put into the code so that there's a minimum fire size and other criteria that's realistic to today's environment, I think that would be very helpful. The problem I think you're gonna run into is that no one's gonna use performance-based design if it's based off of today's criteria, if the prescriptive codes are not based off of today's criteria, because that's gonna be the much easier path every single time. And cars is a great example where we have now lithium-ion vehicles, which we're still putting them in parking garages, the same thing as we put cars that were built, in the 70s. So, I think the codes have to kind of move in the same direction, prescriptive and performance-based, in order to have a holistic approach and to give people options, but also to kind of move things forward so that a performance-based design is not so crazy far off from what the prescriptive design is, so it's still recognizable. So I think defining that primary criteria kind of sets everything up for success, and having something that's measurable is very, it takes the subjectiveness out and the differentiation between jurisdictions of what's reasonable. It makes it much more uniform to be used, internationally. So I think that would be a really great first step. I think it's going to be a difficult first step, but probably the best place to start.
Thank you. Bob.
I look at a simple step is, how come we don't reference the performance code in the IBC? When I look at what reference and what codes I'm going to why don't we have in there that performance-based design shall be done in accordance with the International Performance Code, right? Because that at least gets you back to going through chapter 3, chapter 4, and doing it in a structured way. I messed around with smoke control systems for a whole bunch of years, and when I look at smoke control systems, well, that design fire, you don't get to use a design fire unless it's approved by the code official. Now, let's just say there's varying levels of how well that's exercised, but the concept is based on, well, if this is what you're doing, what's really going to happen in this space, right? Like a mall. Well, it's based on a kiosk. I said, well, what about the Winnebago that's coming in for the blood drives? Well, they don't intend to do that. I said, right. And what about the cars that are going to be raffled off from the car dealership at the mayor owns, right? Well, we don't intend to do that, right? I mean, let's be realistic about this, right? So, there's a key right there is you're not supposed to get to the design part of a smoke control system unless you agree on what you're designing it for, right? So really, I don't know why we haven't done it before that. You know what? Performance-based design shall be done in accordance with the performance code, right? So that you push them back through the system, right? And that we get that goal setting in the beginning, right, before we move on to all the other work behind it.
Thank you. John.
Yeah, Brian, I think you bring up an excellent point. I was on the IFC drafting and performance committees initially when it was set up, at least for the fire code back in 1997. And I recall one of the things that we talked about, and I think I was even one of the ones that suggested it, is, we should put a performance statement in front of every code requirement so that people know what it is, because the institutional knowledge is going to be lost real soon on, where our 200-foot travel distance came from or all this other stuff. And, the committee at the time just balked on it because they were in a short time frame, and, trying to research all that history was just, it sure seemed overwhelming to everybody. But I agree with you. We don't have performance measures on the stuff in our prescriptive code. So how do we expect them to, to do all this? So, and when we do training in our office for new code officials, the majority of the time that we spent on it, and we've been both praised and chastised for this, majority of the time we spent training is, let's talk about the intent. You can read the technical requirements, but we need to explain the intent to you. And we explain things like travel distance is not a measurement of travel, it's a measurement of time, and where some of these numbers came from, and they're really committee numbers. And anybody that's been on the code committees know how that came about. I wanted 10,000 and Brian wanted 20,000, and we both got to catch a plane, and so let's agree to 15,000 and call it good enough. I mean, these numbers did not come down off the mount with the other 10 commandments. So, I really think we do. We need to specify in the code, and I know that's going to make the book thicker, but we need to specify what the intent is of this stuff.
Great, thank you. Dan?
Yeah, I waited for John's hand to go up first so I could go after him, just for the record. So, we put in, I put in a last cycle to adopt the performance code, and it ended up, like you said, one of these horse trading incidents ended up with CJ and Gary and Ray Grill's Appendix O, which is great. And, it's there. We can start using it. I was thinking in doing the research, like the UK version, has, this is what the code said, but here was the reason. And, it was like a backwards commentary. The biggest resistance to adopting the performance code is other fire protection engineers, which is kind of the game here, and where the world sits. So I like what John's talking about. I think, even if it was not a code, used, in a code document, just knowing where it came from is more important, because, barring most people on this call, nobody knows how to read a monograph to figure out all these things, or you weren't there, to, like you said, we're going to split the difference today. Everybody good with that? Okay. Height and building area tables, great example. Just a small section of the code. So yes, I think we should be writing this stuff down. And if anything comes out of this, Brian, I would hope that just better documentation of the intent statement, I think, for training for the future is so important. Just a little aside, is there anything we need to do, Brian, just because of actionable items before the admin code group B closes in a couple of weeks, that we need to hold a placeholder for any of this stuff?
Well, I don't know that there's anything particular. I mean, what I'm trying to do here is not really for this upcoming code cycle, but to say, maybe we need a complete rewrite. And if there is something that can go in, like, again, more referencing the ICC performance code and putting more guidance around it. But I personally think we don't have it really sorted out what we need to do yet. And we get into trouble sometimes, putting in Band-Aids, without actually treating, the main cause. But if there are things that could be put in, certainly do that. But, my scope, and I guess I didn't go over this earlier, but just to put it in context, is I'm running kind of a 6-month or so research effort to compile kind of information and the sense from the market. This is, the last roundtable. I would have gotten, 80 or 90 people over 8 meetings, and I'll be writing up kind of outcomes, but also in February, and you can put this on your calendars, there'll be a workshop that's going to run over 2 weeks. And because we're in the virtual environment, the aim is for February 2nd to be the first session, probably in the afternoon Eastern time. And we'll try to run like a typical workshop with breakout sessions. So I'll kind of overview, have some presentations of what we've been doing, break out into sessions, and then take a 2-week pause where the breakout groups try to get together and talk about issues, and then come back on 2 weeks later on the 16th to report out and kind of see where we're at with the structure. So what I'm going to do ahead of that is all of the roundtable recordings will be posted. I'll have a summary up of what has been discussed. I intend by middle of January to have a little matrix of, where is everybody kind of on the same page of what's needed? Where do we see some differences? Where are the gaps? And that'll inform kind of what the discussion will be in the workshop. At the end of the workshop and sometime in March, I'll compile all the data and make a recommendation to ICC in terms of at least what I think from what I've heard from the stakeholders of where to go. And my sense at this point is, I think they should reinitiate a development effort on the performance code. I think it needs to be, bottom up, starting over with some of these issues we've talked about, more quantification, more rigor, more defined approaches. We need to maintain the parts like chapters 3 and 4 that really require the discussions to be had, and try to get away a little bit from looking at a performance design as a piecemeal approach to getting around a problem, and more of an approach to developing performance that works. And I think that whole mindset is missing, at least in the fire side. It exists more in structural and in energy, but it just completely lacks on the fire side. So I don't know what ICC and the board will decide, but my recommendation is that that kind of effort needs to go forward. Maintaining groups like this that can be expert groups that feed into it over the course of a product development would be helpful, and that we got a lot of work to do. And I'm hopeful that'll gain traction, but my discussion with all the groups is that something like this is needed. And I see that where that's going to go. So I see you had your hand up again, Dan. Kind of cut you off there.
Nope, I took it back down. You're good.
Okay, so that's kind of the plan forward, and put it on your calendars. And the reason I did the roundtable discussions in smaller groups was I didn't want to have too many people, fighting over terminology and approaches. I wanted to get everything on the table and see where we're at first. And we're actually pretty much in agreement, which is really good. And I think that's something that, we avoided a bit of the finger pointing and had more kind of an introspective look at what we all need to do, which is helpful. So I'm hoping that's going to set a good basis. Steve.
I think that your path, I think this needs to be rethought from the beginning, for sure, because I've got the scars to prove what it's like trying to fix it a change at a time from the last code cycle. The other thing is I would and this is a really tough question, I'm not sure to answer it, is it seems like there's a number of avenues where you have a partial performance code aspect, which is being used actively, like energy and structure being the things. And is it possible the way the performance code seems to be structured now is you have two paths. You have prescriptive and performance. If you get on the performance path, you're supposed to stay there. That's never going to happen because there's going to be prescriptive elements which make more sense to use. And people are going to, for whatever reason, whether it's avoidance of issues or use of innovations, they're going to want to use performance-based things, which are going to be semi-like alternate means and methods requests. But I think that the performance code use needs to recognize that it can be done for elements of design. That's one thought. Because the other thing I'm thinking about is if I go to an owner, and I'm going to get myself in trouble with AIA because I'm going to talk about fees. If I go to an owner and say, I'd like to use performance design, and it's only going to cost you 50% more, but we'll save you money in design, in construction, they're going to look at me like I'm nuts. So it's never going to happen where you're going to get it done. The other thing is when we talk about science and probabilistic sorts of things, if you delve into maximum credible earthquakes, that's black magic. It's basically making up a number of 1% of a probable earthquake that might happen 50 years in the future. It could happen tomorrow morning. It's got a lot of numbers around it, but it's still kind of figuring out what might happen.
Yeah, good observations. And, a couple of things on that and going back to some other discussion, I did want to bring up how Canada approached their objective-based codes when we were talking about intent statements. So when Canada built what they called their objective-based building code, they put a 10-year effort into trying to determine what the objective was for each of the clauses in the National Building Code of Canada. And so the way their code is structured, Section A is the objective statements, and it maps to every prescriptive requirement that's in Part B of the objective code. And if you want to do a performance-based design, you have to meet the objectives that are up front, and you can see how it maps to the prescriptive requirements, but that's all laid out. And they stopped at the objective level because they didn't have all the measures for performance yet, but they wanted that as kind of a strong framework to work with. So I think doing something like that or requiring something like that so that we understand what the objectives or intents of the prescriptive is to set things up front is really important. To this issue of, the way the current performance code is structured, you do prescriptive or performance. I think there's a couple of issues there. One, very few buildings in very few countries expect any building to be done 100% performance. In fact, pretty universally around the world, the amount of performance-based design is on the order of 5 to 15% of building stock, because you're not going to need to do many buildings in performance. You can learn from performance to modify the prescriptive, but a standard 3-story office building in a, let's call it a non-seismic zone, really doesn't need to be performance-based. And even in the seismic zone, once you know what to do, you don't have to do the performance analysis every time. So I think, the difference is that in most countries, the performance requirements and objectives are the legally binding part. And then your alternatives are prescriptive or performance. And often the prescriptive cites, performance-based methods as well. We're lacking that part up top that lays out those intents and objectives. And so when you're doing an alternative methods and materials, you don't have that pathway to help you sort it out. So, just an example is England. The building regulations are about 19 pages of functional requirements. You can follow the approved documents, which is like following the IEBC, or you can do performance. And even if you go into the approved documents, there may be elements that you would do performance-based, but you have that pathway that defines what the performance expectations are along the way. When we're not doing that, it gets into this problem where every alternative design in every jurisdiction is different, even if the problem is the same and the building is the same everywhere, because we haven't sorted out, that hierarchy. So sorting that out in any reimagining of the ICCPC, I think would be really important in clarifying. The other thing I would say to that is that and I don't win any fans with fire protection engineers when I say this, but I think any even partway performance-based design needs to have a full performance approach, not from the fact that you have to engineer everything, but if you don't go through defining the loads, understanding the impacts, demonstrating how extending this exit path with this smoke control is not going to have an impact on the structure or somewhere else is important. And when you short circuit the process, you don't know that you've achieved all the performances that you're aiming for. And I think that's a big problem. And quite frankly, if it costs more to do performance the right way up front, don't have a problem with that, because you should be focused on the performance of the building to achieve the safety objectives you need. And if you can't do that, then I think we all have a big problem. So that's just my bias, which I'm trying not to interject too much. I'm conscious of the time. We're about 15 minutes from our scheduled end time. What I would like to do is make sure I go around the room one more time, and I want to pick up a couple of folks here that haven't contributed too much because we've been chatting away, but maybe I'll start with Greg to see if you have anything you want to add in that hasn't been covered, or if there's anything you want to emphasize that has been discussed that this process should think about going forward.
I think what you just stated, the comments you just stated were spot on. I don't think it could have been said better. I think it's right in relationship with what Bob Davison was saying in regards to that center piece that you're talking about that's missing. I think a lot of times just to add in on what Dan Nichols said, and I think a couple others, I think a lot of times individuals, organizations, and fire marshals feel overwhelmed because these engineers walk into their facilities, they drop all of this documentation in their lap and say, hey, here's what we want to do for alternative materials and methods. And I think it goes right into what you were saying and right into what Bob is saying. We sit down and have that meeting and establish some goals, objectives, and some criteria first. I think those individuals are going to feel a little comfortable going forward. And I think also what John and Dan said in regards to the education piece, I think us being able to identify that that's the issue, resolve that piece is the issue, and then provide education to those individuals saying, look, this is the first piece you need to, this is the first chunk. I think a piece of that education needs to include those organizations and jurisdictions that don't have the expertise like what's on this Zoom meeting. If you don't have that expertise, here's the way to reach out and here's a way to do that. I think that alleviates a lot of that fear.
Great, thank you. Tim Deal, have any comments to add in?
I mean, I think we're all right there. We all identified the need for education on both sides of it. I think then the later question that comes into effect, and at least that's what's in my mind, is then the follow through with that to the inspection part of it. Because there is that part, somebody's got to look at this. Somebody's got to, even though it's approved in the performance, we got to take that drawing and then we got to go look at it and make sure that it's done in accordance with that. And then there's the follow-up that comes on later on. And I know that's a bigger discussion down the road, but it's still part of the process that we all have to think about. And I think that's where, a lot of what I saw was I can see it on paper. I can look at the numbers and I can say, yes, this should work for that application. But then taking that and having it transferred to the actual design, the actual build, the 3D concept, and being able to say, yes, it's the same way, and yes, it will work. I know I go back to a smoke design that was done at a big mall. Here again, I agree. The fire was much smaller than what could be anticipated for a mall, but it worked. And the AHJ on site, accepted it. To this day, do I think it'll work? Maybe, maybe not. But it's that put it on paper, watching it and having the concept there.
Great, thank you. Jonathan Lund.
I don't really have anything to add, but what's been said before. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you. John Nischa.
Nothing more to add. Thank you.
Jen Hoyt.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I think it's been some really good input from some people. So this is a good group of people that I think have kind of covered all of the different aspects. So I think it was a really informative and helpful session.
Thank you. Dan Nichols. If you're still with us.
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you, Brian, for putting this group together. Really enjoyable conversation. And thanks everybody else who engaged. I think we should get together again. This group is a nice group to talk about these items. And I just had one parting thought after listening to everybody's comment, and that was, in the energy world, in the structural world, you don't say, well, we're not going to do this. And, I promise I'll turn the thermostat down. I promise that I'll put the storm shutters up before a hurricane. And I think there's some lessons to learn out of how those disciplines continue to do their performance design. Because I really, I look forward to the document that Steve referenced to read through that. I think it's going to provide us some great direction. So thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you. And I'll go over to Steve.
I think the only thing, this is a great discussion, and I'm glad I was able to be a part. The only thing I would add, and I'm not sure this is a process, but there's something that happens. I'm always reluctant to use other jurisdictions, but San Francisco has a process built into their code for what they call pre-application meetings, which usually happen at schematic design, and where you meet with the building and the fire and whatever inspection folks you need. And they have folks on their side of the table who come to those. And you usually meet with the owner and the designer and a code consultant if I'm involved. And those discussions come out with a set of meeting minutes, which are then bound into the drawing and become part of a permit set, so that it's a way at the beginning, before you've made concrete, literally or figuratively concrete decisions, to record something where there's an agreement between the two parties and you can talk about it in detail. The meetings last usually 2 hours. You pay a fee for it and that sort of thing, but it's a formal process. And it's somewhere between, and most of the discussions fall somewhere between what would be an alternate means request and a discussion of performance-based design criteria when I'm dealing with it from the fire and life safety point of view, because they're usually not about structural engineering or energy. So I'd say that might be one of the things to think about in terms of formalizing the partial versus total nature of performance design, and then how and when you should talk to each other from the terms of the AHJ and the project proponent about how to implement the PC.
Yep, good point. Just as a side note, we tried to build that into the SFPE approach with the design brief, but still, nobody's, well, not nobody, so few people are doing it. So it needs to go in the regulatory side or the administrative side to require it, so that step is made, because that solves or helps with a lot of issues.
Yeah, that's a San Francisco Administrative Bulletin, which is their own internal adoption.
Yep, great. Bob.
So I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is we're not the target audience. No, the people involved in this call, heavily involved, you know, as John mentioned earlier, you know, like some institutional knowledge is moving on because, well, some of us have been doing this for decades, right? And when you have people that have been doing that long and they leave, you know, a whole bunch leaves in their head, right? And they don't necessarily give their books and notes to anybody as they go, right? So I think we have to remember who the target audience is and recognize that when you look at chapter 1 of the performance-based code, it's intimidating to a code official, right? The amount that they have to address conceptually, it's time, it's work, right? Cost, right? When they're in many cases overburdened as it is, right? And they may look at it that way, like, I don't have time to do this, right? I think the fact that peer review is built in has to be highlighted, has to always be upfront a discussion with the target audience that there is peer review required. They pay for it. This is a person that's going to analyze all this and do that in-depth review for you, right, as part of the process. And I don't know whether there should be, you know, recognition that jurisdictions should have special fees for performance-based because it's a much more in-depth review. It takes more time, takes a little bit more research in some cases. Because I think we have to wrestle with the fact that like in any profession, there's the high level, there's the good level, and there's the ones pushing something through that they count on getting through the system because maybe the code official isn't going to take that deeper look, and they require deep look in performance-based, right? You know, prescriptive's a little more easy to check the boxes off. Did I meet this section? Did I meet this section or not? So I think that's got to be part of the discussion, you know, as we move forward, how to make that less intimidating for them, how to provide for, look, the resources are there for you, because it's the target audience we want to embrace and agree with what we suggest going forward.
Thank you. Dwayne.
Yeah, so again, thanks for letting me be part of this process. I agree, you know, the best, probably the best project, which was the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, because I had a previous stadium built. We had the pre-function meeting, the pre-criteria, and said, here's what all we're going to have to do. And it even though we had a couple hiccups here and there, you know, the key was it went smooth and we could go back to originally, here's what we agreed upon and what we had to do to prove certain issues. I just want to emphasize that I think the input is one of the biggest problems we have. The information that is often referenced at the SFPE handbook and stuff, to me, is way too close to the threshold. For example, when we talk about carbon monoxide buildup in a fire model, I don't want somebody passing out. I want to make them at least have a headache, but that's the highest threshold I want them to have before they evacuate the building. So I always lower certain criteria in that. And to me, I don't quite understand I understand why they get the information, but I don't understand why they always use the highest threshold of points of loss of consciousness and things like this in some of their performance criteria. So to me, if we can have that input that maybe gives that threshold, gives lower threshold that, you know, is, you know, this is a normal performance, and then here's some levels in the middle to give the input information, so that from the experience I have is, you may not know the answer, but at least you know the right questions to say, this doesn't look right. Explain a little bit further. Where did you get this, or how do you get this, or why are we using that level when, in my opinion, this ought to be here? You know, the temperature rating is another thing. Why in the world do you want to use a temperature rating where you have a 3rd degree burn in 5 seconds when you ought to make it an uncomfortable level of, yeah, you may have 3rd degree burn if you stay there for 10 minutes, but you know, why a 5-second exposure of that temperature level? So again, things like that is what really doesn't make sense to me. And I think if we can help define some of that input information, with various opportunities or things that you can deal with, that's what I think would be beneficial. But I appreciate being part of this discussion.
Thank you. And I'll just check in with Carl to see if you had any comments, observations.
No, Brian, I'm still awake, trust me. In multitasking, I'm sure, like my other colleagues out there, but really good discussion today. Appreciate it. I think there's a lot to be learned through the process. And I mean, you can never go wrong with, I think, the heads that we've got in the room here. You know, when you don't feel like the smartest guy in the room, and you know you're not the smartest guy in the room, you're in good company. So thanks for everybody's input and feedback today. And again, from a staff standpoint, happy to support the effort any way possible along with Brian's effort. So thanks to everyone, and we'll catch up with you soon.
Great, thank you. And I guess just a couple of closing comments. One, it seems like everybody's interested to continue if we can do this again and carry forward. There were a whole lot of things we didn't get to today. The whole peer review and review process is one of them, and education, diving into that more and everything else. So I'm not sure if we'll be able to do it before the workshop, but we'll see how we can get it in there, because the review and even third-party review, independent, that some countries use, and building warrant of fitness, going back to the maintenance issue, we weren't able to tackle that. So there's a whole lot of things that we might come back to later. So the next steps for closing out this is that I'll in the next couple of days write up notes from the meetings. I'll set up a Dropbox site. I'll post the recording and the summary notes. I'm trying not to be verbatim, but I'm trying to capture all the key points people made and then have a short summary. And probably the short summary will be posted with the other material. And if you have a chance to look at that before the holidays, that'll be good, because I'm looking to get all the recordings and summaries posted early next year. And I might even put the recordings up, even if I don't have the summaries quite done yet, so that anybody who's trying to get away from in-laws, no, I didn't say that, during the holidays, will have an option of something else to listen to. But I really do appreciate all of the input. I look forward to working with you all in the future, and thank you very much. With that, I'll wish you a happy holidays, and look forward to talking again.
Thank you.
Happy
Thanks,
all.
everybody.
Thank you.
Karen.